Hello and welcome to this edition of The Deep Dive Perspective, a show in which we bring to you often voices who are suppressed or censored on mainstream television because of the truth they tell. Often we also pick those topics which are very sensitive and often those which are being censored as well. That makes us, I guess, persona non gratis, but we're persevering. We're going to continue bringing these voices to you and continue to try and unearth the real truth, because that's what journalists do. That's what real journalists do. And so we'd love you to press that like, share and subscribe button so that we can bring to you the kind of fantastic voices that we've already been bringing. And today is no different. We have with us the honor of welcoming Dr. Syed Mohammad Marandi, Professor Syed Mohammad Marandi, I should actually say, and he's of course from Tehran University and no stranger to people who've been watching various issues around the Middle East being analysed and dissected, and he's one of the most kind of, I think the most authoritative and honest voices with regard to that region, if I might say so. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Marandi. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for your kind words.
It's an honor because it's not often that we get voices from the part of the world which has been essentially stigmatized, stereotyped, vilified, and assaulted with every kind of phobia I can possibly imagine. Iran, of course, and linked to Iran, of course, is inexorably Palestine. Linked to Palestine is inexorably Israel and the rest of the West Asia region. You can't talk about one without obviously going into all the others. And of course, what we're seeing during the last few weeks, and it's actually been kicking off for a month or two or more, is that now Israel is almost finding the excuse to expand its interests in Syria, quite possibly. The Druze are up in arms, and the Druze are being apparently protected by Israel. Israel, in its magnanimity, is going to protect the Druze of Syria, and they're, lo and behold, actually willing to bring Ahmad al-Shara, alias Mr. Gilani of ISIS, formerly, apparently, and they're willing to bring him to task, even though only weeks earlier he was negotiating peace, love and harmony between Zionism, the American empire and Syria. Dr. Marandi, I'm going to start with this issue first, because you were in Lebanon, certainly when Israel was bombing it to smithereens not so long ago, and you are very aware of the Syrian scenario, but hopefully that will lead us into the general discussion about the region. What do you make of the latest happenings in Syria?
Obviously, the Israeli regime has no love for the Druze or for anyone else in Syria. If they did, they wouldn't have supported ISIS and Al-Qaeda during the period of the Dirty War. Since 2011, they, alongside other entities that surround Syria, they've been supporting these extremist groups under the general umbrella of the United States and the Timber Sycamore operation, which was designed to overthrow the Syrian government. First, the United States and its regional allies, Qatar and Turkey in particular, they helped to overthrow the government in Libya. And then after that, they moved on to Syria. And in the case of Syria, the Israeli regime was just as much involved in supporting extremist groups as were the Turks, the Jordanians, the Arab oil and gas-rich regimes, family regimes in the Persian Gulf, and NATO. We have to remember that Jake Sullivan, who was the national security advisor for previous U.S. President Biden, he sent an email to Hillary Clinton on February the 12th, 2012, that in Syria, Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda is on our side. That was in early 2012, a decade after 9/11. So from the very beginning, Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda and ISIS, which later emerged, were in the American camp. In fact, the subsequent Secretary of State of the United States, Kerry, he said in a leaked audio to the so-called Syrian opposition back then at the UN building that we allowed, meaning the United States, we allowed ISIS to advance on Damascus to put pressure on the government. So obviously, when the United States and when the Israeli regime and when others are supporting ISIS and Al Qaeda, then that basically means that they don't support the minorities, they don't support anyone in Syria. So obviously that includes the Israeli regime. Their antagonism towards the Syrian people, I think, is clear. But what the West has done by supporting ISIS and Al Qaeda, which are takfiri groups, is that they have intentionally pushed Syria towards Balkanization because these groups are intolerant. They slaughter people. They're not different from Zionists. Zionists are supremacists, and these groups, they see themselves as supreme and everyone else is inferior and often worthy of death. So these groups, by gaining power in Syria, they automatically marginalize everyone else, whether it's the Alawites or the Christians or the Kurds or the Druze. They all see them as enemies, or Sunnis, secular Sunnis, Sufi Sunnis, traditional Sunnis, those who do not abide by their takfiri ideology, their Salafist, Wahhabist takfiri ideology. And I think that was intentional from the very beginning, the choice made by the West and the Israeli regime and this coalition that brought about the dirty war to promote the most extreme groups possible, because that would be the best way to destroy Syria. So what these takfiri groups have done is that they have been trying to effectively push the Druze into the arms of the Israeli regime. My understanding is that some members of the Druze community, they have made this foolish choice of seeking support for the Israeli regime, but the majority have not done so.
Well, it's interesting.
What is important is to prevent bloodshed and from Syrians from killing each other, because that's exactly what the Israeli regime wants.
Well, that's a really interesting take, because the accusation from a lot of these takfiris would be that actually Iran and the axis of resistance would love to foment division in Syria and to cause that kind of the very, very kind of pandemonium, which actually Israel is doing. So that's a fascinating turn up in itself. I'll let you address that if you like. But they created the climate for this. I mean, the Shara establishment, by unleashing their head chopping hordes on Alawi territories. So, of course, it would have made naturally the Druze very, very defensive and fearful. So it's almost like a tactic to go and, rape, kill, murder, maim, torture an entire ethnic minority, and of course, or a religious minority in the Alawis' case as well. And then that creates a negative kickback on the entire region. So Syrians will stop looking at themselves as Syrians, and all of them will start seeking to align with arguably their ethnic or their religious denominations. Is that a deliberate tactic, do you think?
Well, these takfiri people are not rational actors, and they're not rational people in general. And they are deeply intolerant, and they are very emotional. And their supporters are unfortunately similar to them. And the oil and gas wealth of the Persian Gulf has been used extensively for a huge network of, shall we call them, cultural centers and television networks and media outlets to create sectarianism and promote sectarianism, especially since 2011. But this began much earlier. It began when the Saudis and the Americans and the British used Wahhabism on the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan in order to fight against the Soviet Union. We should recall that in 1979, Carter and Brzezinski hatched a plan to encouraged the Soviet Union to invade Afghanistan so that they could turn it into Vietnam for the Soviet Union. In other words, they wanted to sacrifice a country, a nation, in order to weaken their adversary. And in the process, they began to promote extremism, Takfiri ideology. In fact, back then, the initial books that were for school children on the border of Pakistan and Afghanistan, which were Takfiri, they were published by by an American university. The Nebraska Omaha University printed those books. And of course, it led to the spread of extremism, but it was also used in order to create a divide in the region because the revolution in Iran was expanding. It was anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, and it advocated social justice. It was pro-Palestinian. And these regimes, they wanted to halt the influence of the revolution. So they began to export Wahhabism and this extremism. In Syria, the same was done. Qatar and Turkey in particular, along with other oil and gas-rich countries in the Persian Gulf alongside Qatar, they funded these extremist groups. Saudi Arabia, years later, turned away from this under Mohammed bin Salman for their own reasons. Mohammed bin Salman chose a different course for Saudi Arabia, but the focus of this became Qatar, which promoted this sectarianism, especially since 2011, and Turkey under Erdogan. So this vast network of cultural centers and media has created a great deal of sectarianism and hatred. And that is why it is understandable why many people believe that this about Iran, because they believe all sorts of things about Iran. But I think if anyone looks carefully and with objectivity, Iran is the only country that supported the people of Bosnia when Bosnia was being destroyed. Bosnia is not a Shia country. It was not a Shia country. And yet it was only Iran that went and sent military aid to Bosnia and turned the tide and allowed it. And basically, it was the reason behind why Bosnia exists today. In fact, people from Lebanon also went there from the resistance to help. On the other hand, the only country alongside Yemen that supports the Palestinian people, who are Arab and Sunni, is Iran. It has been making sacrifices for the people of Palestine for well over 4 decades. The sanctions against Iran, the wars waged against Iran, they're all about Palestine. So those who think or believe, mistakenly or otherwise, that Iran wants a weak Syria, they obviously are listening to the Takfiri propaganda that has been well funded over the decades. But it is the exact opposite. In fact, if we look at what happened in Syria, in 2011, when the United States began the dirty war, Iran did not get involved, nor did Hezbollah. In 2012, Iran did not get involved, nor did Hezbollah. But only after tens of thousands of foreign fighters were brought into Syria from across the world, Takfiri fighters, only in the summer of 2013 did Hezbollah and Iran gradually get involved. So I think anyone who looks at the history of what happened in Syria, they would recognize that these are false statements. And I think it's very clear that what is happening now in Syria is exactly what Iran was concerned about, that an extremist group supported by the West, after destroying the country, they would turn against the different groups of people and they would tear the country apart. And unfortunately, there's a huge risk of that happening. And the only way to stop this from happening is for courageous people in Syria to bring the nation together, to unite the people against the real adversary, and that is the Israeli regime.
Well, that's a lot of good history, and people don't know the history, so that context is set. in terms of where we're heading now, Syria is really pivotal and central to the entire West Asian region. And in a way, that's why the axis of resistance was also very much in need of it as a corridor to get to Hezbollah. Hezbollah, in many ways, has been hit hard. This is clear. And it is now surrounded, essentially, by Takfiri forces, very antagonistic local Lebanese forces, which are sold out to Israeli and American interests. It's also, of course, got Israel right on its border. At the same time, you've got an Iraq, Seyed Marandi, which is also, it's penetrated by Americans, by the Israelis. The Kurdish regions have a long history of association with both. The Turks themselves, Erdogan, who's proven to be extremely slippery and quite pro-Zionist, basically, is also now on good terms with the PKK, which was a thorn in his side. And they're now evidently also being armed and prepared and weaponized, perhaps to launch instability in Iraq. So it's not just Syria, which has now got the Takfiri problem, which has kind of taken root. There's a strong chance that from Syria, all sorts of other elements will reignite those kinds of efforts that they made during the time when Haji Soleimani and Mehdi Mohandes had fought so hard, along with the popular mobilization forces back then, to eradicate, i.e., ISIS and Takfiris. Your prediction, how do you see the future beyond Syria in terms of the reverberations of what's going on there now and Israel's influence, clear influence, and of course America's presence and its looting of the oil? How do you see Iraq perhaps as the next potential piece on the chessboard which may go down?
Well, Iraq today is not the Iraq of a decade ago when ISIS, funded by Turkey, supported by NATO, entered Iraq. The government was on the verge of collapse. And one reason why Iran and Hezbollah were active in Syria was to prevent ISIS and al-Qaeda from taking over the entire region. These terrorists were driven back. And we have to remember that Jolani himself began his activities in Iraq as a member of ISIS. And he was involved in the car bombings that we saw on the streets of Baghdad and elsewhere, where they targeted ordinary civilians and killed thousands in the name of ISIS, or back then the Islamic State of Iraq, before it was renamed into ISIS. But Iraq today is much stronger, and there are challenges that face it, but the Iraqi armed forces and the popular mobilization forces today are much better equipped to deal with such challenges. One thing that I'd like to also point out is that today, anyone who looks at the region with open eyes, they would understand who the real friends of Palestine are and who are not the real friends of Palestine. Hezbollah sacrificed itself and gave many casualties and lost many women and children in the Israeli regime's barbaric airstrikes because they were supporting Gaza. Yemen has made huge sacrifices and lost many people because they were supporting the people of Gaza, and they continue to do so. The Iranians, they've experienced decades of sanctions, maximum pressure sanctions, and more recently, a war of aggression by the United States and Israel because it supports Gaza. Meanwhile, we see that Mr. Erdogan is transporting cheap oil to Netanyahu, and he's been doing it throughout this genocide. He continues to trade with Netanyahu. He has diplomatic relations with Netanyahu. And he even has direct flights to Israel. Qatar, too, their relationship with the United States is very clear. The most important U.S. base in the region is in Doha, Qatar, CENTCOM. And as Steve Bannon said, Qatar has gone a long way in moving towards the interests of the United States over recent years. So it is clear that these countries are in the NATO camp, or at least the ruling elites in these countries are all in the NATO camp, whether it's Jordan or Egypt or Turkey or the Emirates or Morocco or Bahrain. They're all in the American camp. And so for these Takfiri people to somehow target Iran or to point Iran as their enemy, I think is based not on logic or reason, but is based upon an irrational hatred that exists within them because they have been conditioned to believe in a Takfiri ideology. And that is exactly what today is also tearing Syria apart. We see the atrocities that they carried out against the Alawites and the fact that they would steal Alawite women and take them as sex slaves. We saw when recently a suicide bomber destroyed a church in Damascus, how the government's response was with indifference. They were indifferent about this atrocity. And now we're seeing also today how these Takfiri groups are slaughtering men, women, and children among the Druze community. Of course, many in the Druze community, sadly, are doing the same. Both sides are committing atrocities. But the point is that the main responsibility lies with the ruler in Damascus. And the ruler in Damascus is someone who supports Takfiri ideology. He is a Takfiri, and his groups and supporters are Takfiri. And therefore, it's not just about Alawites. It's not just about Christians. It's not just about Druze. It's about anyone who thinks differently from them. So they are tearing Syria apart. And they really are not in any position to blame Iran for anything. The Iranians are not even present there anymore. They were murdering Alawites and trying to attribute them to Iran. Well, what about the Christians? What about the Kurds? What about the Druze? That is a deeply flawed logic, and I'm sure they know it. And those who have a bit of education among them, they know it as well. But in any case, the Iranians are very concerned about the fate of Syria. Syria must remain intact. The Balkanization of Syria is an Israeli objective. And I believe that, unfortunately, Erdogan and Netanyahu together, through their alliance, they have been the key players alongside Qatar and the United States in bringing Syria to where it is today.
Well, I can't go against any of your narrative there because, yes, the north of Syria is still very much a satellite of Turkey. The central part of Syria where Sharia is supposedly strong is clearly another Turkish satellite, really. And then Israel has pretty much taken out the whole of the southern part of, the southwestern part of Turkey for sure. And then up in the northeast, we find the Americans and the Kurds. They're not exactly giving into the central government in any big way. So that is essentially Balkanization already stamped all over Syria, to be fair. Do you see that reversing? Do you see a situation where that might be rescued even now?
I think it is possible to save Syria from the situation that it is in. I think gradually people are going to recognize the truth in Syria. I think many people do know the truth, and increasingly people will know the truth. Those who created this situation for Syria, where are they today? Why isn't Mr. Erdogan sending in his air force? Why isn't he providing troops on the ground? He has spent many, many billions of dollars of Turkish wealth, but also tens of billions of dollars of Qatari wealth in arming ISIS and Al-Qaeda in order to overthrow the government and effectively destroy the country. Well, why is he now not playing a role to help the Syrian people regain their territory from the Israeli regime? The Israeli regime, after the fall of the Syrian government, has been able to take huge amounts of territory, which are basically the most strategic parts of Syria, and they're not planning to give it up. So instead of helping the Syrian people regain their land and to put pressure on the Israeli regime, What did Turkey do? What did Erdogan do? He tried to create a friendship between Jolani and Netanyahu. Jolani, of course, sent many messages to Netanyahu saying that our enemies are the same as yours. Our enemies are only Iran and Hezbollah. They met in Baku recently. They met in other places as well. What happened after all that? Instead of helping the Palestinian people, Mr. Erdogan went and tried to create a friendship and alliance between Jolani and Netanyahu. But what happened subsequently? We woke up and saw that they were bombing Damascus. Even though the Al-Qaeda regime in Damascus had kissed the ring, the Israelis were ruthless and relentless, and they continue to be so now. Syria is in a very dangerous situation, and the bloodshed between the Druze and the Takfiris is to no one's interest. And both sides are making a horrible situation even worse. But I think that there is a Syrian identity among ordinary Syrians. And if the rulers of Syria were people that put aside or did not promote this ugly ideology and these Takfiri beliefs, then I think that that would go a very long way in bringing harmony among the people across Syria.
Well, Netanyahu hasn't been shy about talking of his ambitions of a greater Israel. Many ministers within the Israeli government have been voicing that. Maps have been placed. They've told us before what they want to do. So some people are going to point the finger at Shara and say that actually this is all a bit of a game because Israel needs an excuse to occupy more Syrian territory, and by going in heavy-handedly with the Druze, that's what Ahmed al-Shara is doing. He's handing over the opportunity for Israel to come in formally, even more strongly, because they've said, I think just yesterday I picked up the news to say that they were saying if these attacks don't stop and if the central government in Syria doesn't rein in their forces, the Bedouin tribes or whoever else is involved there, the central state security, Takfiris, as it were, they've said that the IDF, will get more heavily involved. It does sound like there's a possibility that this is all a little bit of a dramatized, orchestrated exercise in giving Israel that little step closer to actually achieving what it wants, which is up the connection right up to the Euphrates.
I don't think that is the objective of Jolani, but I do think he's a fool. And the problem is that you cannot rein in Takfiris. Why did the Zionists carry out genocide in Gaza? Because they see the Palestinians as subhuman, as inferior. It's not just the prime minister, it is the culture. Overwhelmingly, Zionists support the genocide because they view the Palestinians as inferior. Salafism and Wahhabism have strong elements of Takfiri belief within their belief system. And whether it's the leader or the troops, that exists within them. And that is why they go and slaughter women and children or take women as sex slaves. That's why it's done. There's ample evidence of it just over the past couple of days. It's clear as day. So it's not just about Shara. It's not just about the troops. It's a culture. Actually, the tribes, they are not necessarily Takfiri at all. What the tribes were responding to was the fact that some in the Druze community were aligning themselves with the Israeli regime. That is treason. They're responding to that. But then there's this Takfiri propaganda that is saying that the Druze are Israeli allies. And that is pushing the south of Syria towards a catastrophic situation. But
sure.
the Druze, historically speaking, they resisted the French and they resisted the Israelis. And many Druze throughout history, contemporary history, they lost their lives in resisting Israeli conspiracies. So again, this goes back to the Takfiri people who are in charge in Syria. They are trying to demonize not the traitors, but the Druze. And that is why the Takfiri ideology is so similar to Zionism. The real difference between them is that they are subordinate to Zionism. The Zionists, the Americans, and their regional proxies and allies created this culture of extremism in order to break up the region. Why? Because the Israeli regime wants fragmented small states across the region so that they can rule supreme.
And the US and its involvement, Dr. Marandi, we haven't focused much on that. We know that they're looting the Syrian oil. We know they burned down most of the crops of Syria during the war. They were doing all sorts of dirty tactics. But it's primarily resources which America wants, and it is primarily Israel's, the size of Israel. I mean, Donald Trump was using his pen on the table not so long ago to say Israel was too small to be viable almost. And so they've started expanding by going into the West Bank. Clearly they're expanding by going into Syria. They're trying to go into Lebanon if they can and beyond. So the US is facilitating this, as with the genocide in Gaza. They are also there sowing differences amongst the Kurds. So there's that looming problem of ethnicity in the northeastern part, coupled with Turkey, who you dissected very well in terms of their involvement. Do you see the US, who also has lifted sanctions just in the last week or so? That's also been a case. They've also been praising Ahmed al-Shara, offering him pretty much full support, taken him off, taken the whole of the HTS group actually off the terror lists. The UN hasn't, but the Americans certainly have, and a lot of the other Western governments. Do you see the Americans within this scenario perpetuating a balkanization as well? Is that in their interests?
Yes, without a doubt. The American interests coincide with Israeli interests across the region. The Americans and the Israelis are one and the same. That's why the Americans facilitate the genocide. When it comes to Syria, the United States and the Israeli regime have the same policy. The same is true in Lebanon. The same is true in Jordan. The same is true in Gaza, as well as the West Bank and Yemen and Iran and elsewhere. There's no divide at all between the two. And anyone who believes what the Western media sometimes says about how the U.S. president, whether past or present, has differences, that's simply nonsense. If there are slight differences, it is personal interest. But at a strategic level, the two sides are one and the same. One thing that I think is important for your audience to keep in mind is that the United States does not have the interests of the people in the region at heart. And the United States started the dirty war in Syria. And the United States supported al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria. Even Trump admitted that when he tried to blame it on Obama. But his policies were more or less the same when he came to power. So the West supported ISIS. The West supported al-Qaeda. And therefore, those who supported these groups coming to power in Syria have been pursuing and supporting American policy for 13 years. And for anyone to think that they are doing the Israeli regime harm by pursuing policies that the Israeli regime and the United States support, they're only fooling themselves. They're only deceiving themselves because they are stuck with their sectarian beliefs or their hatred for others. But at the end of the day, the only thing that can save Syria is for a group or people to come to power in Syria which see all Syrians as citizens and to see them as equal citizens. Until that happens, I'm afraid that this situation will only continue and it may get worse. So my general observation is that when it comes to West Asia, if you're following a policy of that the United States is pursuing alongside Israel for 13 years, you're not on the right side of history.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Syed Mohammad Marandi. A fascinating journey and really a lot to take in. But for those who want to really understand what Syria is about, what Israel is doing in Syria, and what the Americans and the Western policies, as well as the Iranian strategies or feelings towards Syria, well, I think Professor Marandi has given us a very encyclopedic summary, really. In essence, what we have is a scenario where resource rape, imperialism, and again, the flagrant violation of international law is taking place, and it is being sanctioned again by the same powers, the same Western Zionist powers that have inflicted millions of deaths across West Asia with the forever wars. And I start those wars really with the first Gulf War, which was inflicted by Western-backed Saddam Hussein, who Professor Marandi was also a victim of gas attacks, which I know that he endured during that war, which was inflicted. And from that time onwards, we've seen nothing but depopulation, the migration, the kind of displacement of populations, the murder, the killing, the torture. It's been endless, and I think, quite frankly, the world is sick of it. But for some reason, these Western powers haven't had enough. They want more, and I think that from what we see, that's what's going on in Syria. More war is probably looming, and the only way we can stop that, I think, is if in the West, particularly, those people who vote in the warmongers, who sanction the politicians and the corporations and the media who supports all these forever wars, unless we rise up and really take our leaders to task, basically vote them out and actually hound them into stopping these wars, nothing will change, because you can't stop wars which are profitable to corporations and which benefit the coffers of the rich and the elite here in the West. It takes two sides to stop a war. And if there's one side which is hell-bent on creating them, then no matter what you do, the likes of Iran, the Axis of Resistance, Iraq, Syria, they're going to be helpless, because they're going to react to what is inflicted on them. And usually the reaction has to be self-defense, and they're entitled to that. Again, my thanks to Seyed Mohammad Marandi for enlightening us. Thank you for addressing this issue around Syria, and thank you for joining us, Professor Marandi. Until the next Deep Dive Perspective, do please not forget to actually press those like, share and subscribe buttons so that we can bring you more fantastic guests. Thank you for watching. Take care.